Since everyone is here, let us honor the family failure. The microphone squealed a high pitch that made my teeth ache. Madeline's acrylic nails dug brutally into the bare skin of my wrist. She was pulling me out from the shadows near the exit doors, dragging me straight into the blinding heat of the stage spotlight. The heavy scent of vanilla buttercream and stale champagne hung thick in the ballroom air, suffocating and sweet. I tried to plant my heels against the polished floorboards, but she yanked harder, her grip acting like a vice. "Come on up here, Claire," she cooed into the microphone. Her voice dripped with that practiced, sugary warmth she always used when she needed an audience to believe her act. I did not fight her physically. I am 38 years old, and as a cardiothoracic surgeon, I spend 12 Ulant hours a day, cracking open chests and repairing beating hearts. Controlling my breathing when alarms go off is second nature. Stillness is the only weapon you have when panic strikes. More importantly, I could see the glow of at least 24 cell phones lifted in the air across the dark room. Their camera lights cut through the dimness, aimed directly at us. Any struggle, any raised voice from me, would just become permanent evidence for the narrative my sister was building. Madeline let go of my wrist only when we stood dead center on the elevated stage. She turned to the crowd, and the heavy silk skirt of her white gown swished against my ankles. The spotlight felt like a physical weight on my skin. I stood perfectly straight, my hands relaxed at my sides, refusing to cross my arms or look at the floor. For those who do not know, my sister said to the room of 300 guests, "This is my older sister." I did not think she would actually show up. She paused, letting the microphone pick up her heavy theatrical sigh. She has no husband, no children, and she could not even be bothered to help care for our sick father these past few months. I had to quit my job to stay home and do it all myself. But she managed to show up today, probably for the free wine and the prime rib. A wave of laughter rippled through the front row, and the bridesmaids, clustered in their matching blush dresses, giggled behind their hands. A few distant relatives chuckled, assuming this was some pre-planned sibling roast, a bit of edgy wedding humor. I did not defend myself, nor did I demand the microphone. I looked past the flashing cameras and the laughing faces, observing the room with the same clinical detachment I used in the operating theater. Madeline was putting on a masterclass in public manipulation, spinning my silence into an admission of guilt. She was punishing me for simply existing outside her control. Then my eyes found the head table. The groom, Owen, was not laughing. He sat rigid in his tailored suit, his hands flat on the white tablecloth. He was staring at his new bride with a slight, confused frown. He had never met me before tonight, knowing only the ghost version of me that Madeline had constructed for him over the past year. But it was the woman sitting next to Owen who caught my full attention. Margaret Whitmore. I had not seen her face clearly when I slipped into the back of the venue 20 minutes ago. The massive floral arrangements and the low lighting had hidden her from my view. Now, from my vantage point on the brightly lit stage, there was no mistaking her. I remembered her face perfectly, recalling the exact shade of her pale skin 18 months ago when she was wheeled into my emergency room with an acute type A aortic dissection. Margaret stared back at me, and I watched the healthy color drain completely from her face. We froze, locked in a moment of absolute recognition across the crowded ballroom. The woman remembered me. She knew my voice, the shape of my eyes, and the calm tone I had used when I held her hand and told her she was going to survive the surgery. Margaret stood up so fast her heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. The harsh, ugly sound echoed through the ballroom, cutting the scattered laughter dead. "I know her," Margaret said. Her voice trembled, but the acoustics of the quiet room carried her words to the back walls. Madeline gripped the microphone tighter, her knuckles turning white. "What did you say, Margaret?" she asked. The sweet tone was still there, but it was brittle now, cracking at the edges. Margaret stepped away from the head table. She ignored her son's questioning look and pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "I know her," Margaret repeated, her voice gaining strength. "That is Dr. Claire Bennett. She is the surgeon who saved my life." The silence in the room became absolute, thick and heavy. The phones that were recording a humiliating joke were now capturing something entirely different. A low murmur of whispers broke out at the back tables and swept forward like a wave. I watched my sister's face, The radiant, triumphant smile melted away in an instant, leaving behind a pale mask of sheer panic. Her eyes darted from Margaret to Owen and finally to me. Madeline brought the microphone to her mouth. She opened it to speak, to pivot, to spin the story back into her favor. She wanted to explain why the brilliant surgeon was still a terrible daughter. But the damage was already done. The groom was looking at me, really looking at me, and then looking at his mother in shock. In that quiet, fractured moment on the stage, I saw the truth of my family dynamic with perfect clarity. Madeline had not made a mistake. She knew exactly what my career was. And she knew I had kept my married name professionally after my divorce 5 years ago. My sister knew I spent my life saving others. But to her, and to the narrative she had sold her new husband, my worth was only measured by what I gave up for our parents. She had deliberately hidden my last name, my profession, and my independence from her in-laws to keep her victim story intact. She thought she had backed me into a corner. She thought the spotlight and the public shame would force me into quiet submission, just like it always did when we were growing up. My sister knew exactly who I was. What she did not know was that for the past 3 weeks, I had been building a heavily encrypted folder on my computer. I had been pulling bank statements, checking county building permits, and setting up instant fraud alerts on my phone. Madeline thought she was exposing a family failure to her new husband. What she did not know was that I finally knew exactly where the $78,000 for our father's medical recovery had actually gone. 1 hour before I walked into that ballroom, the air conditioning in my hotel room hummed a low, steady note. I stood in front of the full-length mirror and smoothed the fabric of my dark navy dress. The silk felt cool against my palms, grounding me in the quiet space. It was an expensive dress, bought with my own money, and chosen specifically because the muted color would help me blend into the background. On the mahogany desk next to the window, a cream-colored letter rested in a beam of afternoon sunlight. The hospital board back in Charlotte had officially offered me the position of surgical division chief. I had earned every single letter of that title. My divorce had been finalized in March of 2020, more than 5 years ago. Since the day the judge signed those papers, I had built a life completely insulated from the demands of others. I kept the name Bennett strictly for my medical license, my published research, and my professional reputation. My ex-husband and I had parted ways quietly, without children and without a messy financial battle, and he no longer had any part in my world. The townhouse, the retirement accounts, and the chosen circle of friends in North Carolina were all mine. I did not need the Lawson family name, and I certainly did not need their approval. That same morning, just hours before my flight, I had been in the operating theater. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the sharp smell of antiseptic always cleared my mind. My hands had been completely steady while I guided my team through a complicated valve replacement. In the hospital, my colleagues looked to me for critical decisions, trusting my judgment implicitly. Nobody in that building considered me a failure. But my parents and my sister lived in a different reality, one where my success only mattered when they needed someone to pay a bill. My cell phone vibrated against the wooden nightstand, breaking the quiet of the room. A text message from my chief resident lit up the screen, asking if I was surviving the family wedding drama. I typed a quick confirmation, sent it, and tossed the device onto the bed. I almost did not come to this wedding. My mother, Judith, had mailed my invitation exactly 3 weeks ago, long after the standard deadline for out-of-town guests. The thick cardstock had arrived with my name misspelled and contained no +1 option. There was no assigned table number tucked inside the flap. Her message was perfectly clear, communicating that I was expected to send a generous gift, but my actual presence was merely an afterthought. Despite the deliberate slight, I had booked my own hotel room and rented a car at the airport. Having my own transportation gave me an exit plan that did not rely on anyone else. 2 distinct reasons had pushed me to RSVP for a brief 20-minute appearance at the reception. First, I fundamentally believed an older sister should quietly bless a younger sister on her wedding day, regardless of their toxic history. Second, I needed to see Madeline truly happy just once before I severed our financial ties forever. I did not fly across state lines expecting a miraculous family reconciliation. Closing this chapter of my life on my own terms was my only goal. The hotel room phone remained silent, but my cell rang just as I fastened the silver clasp on my watch. The screen displayed my mother's name. I answered on the second ring, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Claire," my mother said, skipping any polite greeting. The background noise on her end sounded like clinking glassware and rushed footsteps across a tile floor. "Do not make tonight about you. Your sister has waited her whole life for this." I pressed a cold hand against the edge of the wooden dresser, feeling the smooth polish beneath my fingertips. "I am just going to stand in the back, Mom. I will stay out of the professional photographs and leave early." A heavy exhale hissed through the speaker. "Just promise me you will not bring up the money," Judith snapped. "We can discuss your little accounting questions next week, after they leave for their honeymoon." "I will not say a word about it to Madeline tonight," I replied. I was telling her the absolute truth. Turning a crowded reception hall into a battleground over stolen funds was never my plan. But my mother did not ask what I intended to do after the music stopped. I ended the call and walked over to the bed where my dark navy clutch lay open. Next to my plastic room key sat a thin, unassuming paper envelope. Inside was a formal notice of access revocation for the Lawson Family Care account, a printed summary of the blocked transactions, and the business card of my civil attorney, Aaron Caldwell. I intended to hand it directly to Judith in the parking lot after the cake was cut. It was a clean, quiet plan to protect our father's medical care without ruining the celebration inside. I zipped the clutch shut, grabbed my coat, and walked toward the door. My mother thought the envelope in my purse was another check. It was the first thing I had ever brought home that would take something away. 5 months before the wedding, in April of 2025, my cell phone vibrated against the metal door of my hospital locker. I had just finished a brutal 12-hour shift. The smell of harsh antibacterial soap and sterile gauze still clung to my skin, and my feet ached against the concrete floor. Judith's name flashing on the cracked screen usually meant a major holiday was approaching, and she needed a contribution for dinner. This time, the silence on the other end of the line felt heavy before she even spoke a word. My father had suffered a mild stroke. He was already discharged and recovering in his own bedroom, but their split-level house was a physical obstacle course for a man who could barely lift his left leg. I immediately offered to hire a professional geriatric care manager to assess the property and organize a safe recovery plan. My mother rejected the idea instantly, her voice tight and defensive. She insisted Madeline had already stepped up to handle every single detail locally. 2 days later, the financial demand arrived in my inbox. My sister had attached a meticulously formatted spreadsheet to her email. The rows were color-coded, listing quotes for a walk-in shower conversion, hallway grab bars, temporary in-home nursing care, and an expensive, adjustable hospital bed. The total sum required at the bottom of the final column was exactly $78,000. In the main body of the message, Madeline had typed one specific sentence that I would revisit countless times over the next year. "Every dollar will be used for Mom and Dad's care." I did not simply write a blank check and hope for the best. My medical training demanded rigorous verification before any intervention. Sitting at my kitchen island with a cold cup of coffee, I dialed the phone number listed on the primary contractor, quote. A woman answered on the third ring. She brightly confirmed the business name and offered to leave a message for the chief estimator. I had no way of knowing then that the local number was merely forwarding to a prepaid cell phone. A quick online search pulled up a basic, professional-looking website and a certificate for standard liability insurance. The paperwork appeared entirely legitimate. Still, handing that massive amount of cash directly to my sister felt negligent. I replied to her email with a firm counteroffer. I would fund the entire recovery process, but I would not deposit the money into her personal checking account. Instead, I drove to a national bank branch on my lunch break and sat in a glass-walled office to open the Lawson Family Care account. I funded it entirely with my own savings. I set Madeline up as an authorized signer, meaning she could write checks directly to approved vendors, but she absolutely could not transfer the balance to herself. My response clearly outlined the rules, requiring weekly updates and copies of the final receipts. The pushback did not come from Madeline. My mother called less than an hour after I hit send, the hostility practically radiating from the phone speaker. "You are treating your own sister like a common criminal," Judith snapped. The sound of running water echoed in the background, likely her washing dishes aggressively. "After everything she is doing for us, you are demanding receipts?" I pinched the bridge of my nose. A dull headache throbbed behind my eyes. "Love does not eliminate accountability, Mom. This is a life-altering amount of money. I just need to make sure the contractors are actually showing up and getting paid. She is doing the brutal, exhausting work while you sit safely in your expensive house," my mother countered. A sharp click signaled the end of the conversation before I could form a reply. Later that evening, the guilt trip escalated. A text message from Madeline chimed on my screen. It was a photograph of our father sitting in his worn leather armchair. His gray cardigan hung loosely off his shoulders, and he was staring blankly at the muted television. Below the image, my sister had written a long, dramatic paragraph detailing how she had just quit her consulting job to become his full-time caregiver. The suffocating weight of obligation settled deeply into my chest. I lived 300 miles away, building a prestigious career, while she was supposedly pausing her entire life to manage his physical therapy. I swallowed my remaining logical doubts. I emailed her the new account routing details and confirmed her signing privileges were active, deliberately maintaining the strict block on personal transfers. The safeguards were in place. What I did not yet understand was that Madeline had built her scheme specifically to work around them. The first major withdrawal triggered an automated email alert on my phone the following Tuesday. $24,500 cleared the new care account. The funds had been electronically transferred to an entity called Northstar Home Recovery LLC. In the transaction memo line, someone had neatly typed a description for a bathroom accessibility deposit. I sat at my desk, printed the banking confirmation page, and slipped it into a fresh manila folder. When I called Madeline to verify the timeline, her tone was light, bubbling with breathless cheer. She assured me the construction crew would be tearing out the old porcelain bathtub by Monday morning. The plan seemed flawless, completely insulated against failure. 3 weeks later, my father called my cell phone and asked me when the men were coming to install the grab bars. My father's voice sounded thin over the phone line, broken by a dry cough that rattled in his chest. The old man was still using the original downstairs bathroom, leaning heavily against the slippery porcelain sink just to brush his teeth. He had called to ask when the work crew was finally coming to install the metal grab bars. I did not hang up and immediately dial my sister. A sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream, but years of surgical training kicked in, demanding observation before reaction. "Dad," I said, keeping my tone perfectly casual so he would not worry. "Do you happen to have the name of the foreman who came to measure the space?" "Nobody came," Thomas replied. The confusion in his words was genuine and unguarded. "Madeline said there was a delay with the tile supplier. She told me to just wait." The next morning, I made a quiet phone call from my hospital office between patient consultations. The clerk at the county permit department sounded utterly bored, clicking her keyboard loudly while humming a tuneless melody. "There is absolutely nothing filed under that residential address," the woman confirmed, her chair squeaking as she shifted weight. "Any bathroom modification involving plumbing requires a building permit, or at least a scheduled inspection record. We have 0 active filings for the Lawson property." I wrote her name, the current date, and the negative reference number on a yellow legal pad, pressing the ink pen down hard enough to indent the paper beneath. My next phone call went to the professional home nursing agency listed on the primary invoice Madeline had provided. I used a calm, administrative voice, claiming I simply needed to update my father's secondary insurance information for their records. The receptionist placed me on a brief hold, subjecting me to 30 seconds of distorted elevator music. "I am sorry, Dr. Bennett," the man said upon returning to the line. "We do not have a Thomas Lawson in our active or pending patient registry. Furthermore, the invoice number you provided does not match our current internal billing format." I thanked him politely and ended the connection. The climate-controlled hospital office suddenly felt freezing. Instead of calling my mother to demand an explanation, I opened my personal laptop. My fingers moved mechanically over the smooth trackpad. I created a new, heavily encrypted folder on my hard drive and named it Family Care Audit. Slowly, Methodically, I downloaded every single bank statement from the care account, saved every email thread, and captured high-resolution screenshots of every text message from my family. I built a chronological timeline of events, ensuring every original digital file remained untouched and legally pristine. 2 days later, I sat across a polished mahogany conference table from Erin Caldwell, my civil attorney. Erin reviewed the printed stack of financial evidence, her expression remaining entirely neutral while she flipped through the pages. "This is highly suspicious, Claire, but it is not quite enough to compel a criminal fraud charge yet," the lawyer advised, tapping a heavy silver pen against the documents. "However, you have more than enough verified grounds to revoke her financial access and preserve the existing data. Do not confront your sister. Let her believe everything is perfectly fine while we build the net." Following her strict guidance, I pulled out my cell phone right there in the law office. I contacted the bank directly, navigating the corporate security protocols to permanently delete Madeline's authorized user profile. I invalidated the physical debit card linked to her name. Finally, I navigated deep into the account security settings and activated instant text message and email alerts for any failed transaction, blocked transfer, login attempt, or payee modification. Madeline would receive absolutely no notification that her access had been quietly severed. Protecting the remaining funds was only half the equation, because my father still needed his blood pressure medication and his upcoming physical therapy sessions. That same afternoon, I rerouted his pharmacy bills and his mortgage contribution to a direct payment system tied directly to my personal checking account. I ensured his essential services would not face a single day of interruption when the storm finally broke. Taking away Madeline's stolen power would never mean abandoning the old man to suffer the consequences. Late that night, a heavy rain started hitting my living room windows, creating a steady drumbeat against the glass. I sat on the sofa with the glowing laptop screen, illuminating the dark room, digging into public business registries. North Star Home Recovery LLC had a digital footprint, but it was incredibly shallow. The company utilized a generic postal box at a local shipping store for its official mailing address. There was no active contractor license registered with the state board, and zero evidence of commercial liability insurance. But the most damning detail sat quietly on the bottom of the public registration page. The registered agent for the entity was listed under a secondary email address that I instantly recognized. It was an old screen name my sister had used during her college years. I stared at the timestamp of the official state filing document, reading the date 3 times to be sure. The realization hit my chest like a physical blow, cold and undeniably sharp. This was not a simple case of a delayed contractor or an overwhelmed family caregiver making a careless administrative mistake. The timeline proved something much worse. The shell company that had absorbed my father's medical funds had been officially registered and incorporated exactly 2 days after he was discharged from the hospital. The fake entity had been created before my sister ever asked me for a single dollar. I parked my sedan in the cracked asphalt driveway of my childhood home. 300 miles of highway stretched behind me. A spontaneous weekend drive driven entirely by the quiet revelations sitting inside my encrypted hard drive. The front yard looked exactly the same as it had during Christmas. No heavy construction dumpsters sat on the grass, and no contractor trucks blocked the garage doors. Stepping through the front entryway, the familiar scent of lemon polish and stale carpet dust hit my lungs. The quiet house felt completely undisturbed by any demolition. I walked straight down the hallway and pushed open the door to the primary bathroom. The original porcelain tub remained untouched, its chipped edges gleaming under the harsh fluorescent vanity light. Not a single metal grab bar had been bolted to the faded floral wallpaper. My father sat in his worn recliner in the living room, leaning heavily to his right side. He looked frail and deeply uncomfortable when he saw me standing in the archway. Before I could even say a proper hello, heavy footsteps sounded from the kitchen. Judith stopped wiping her hands on a damp dish towel, her eyes darting from my face to the empty hallway behind me. "Claire," my mother said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You could have called. The house is a complete mess." "I just wanted to see the bathroom progress, Mom," I replied smoothly, keeping my voice devoid of any open accusation. Dad mentioned there was a delay. The dish towel hit the counter with a loud smack. The contractor had major supply chain issues. and the spring rain pushed their exterior projects back. They will get to us when they get to us. I nodded slowly, pulling a small leather notebook from my purse to maintain the facade of a helpful daughter. What is the foreman's name? I can call their office and handle the scheduling pressure for you. Her posture went entirely rigid. The woman who had raised me suddenly looked like a cornered animal preparing to strike. You do not live here, Judith snapped, taking 2 aggressive steps into the living room. You have absolutely no right to march in here and inspect our lives like some kind of corporate auditor. Madeline is handling every single detail. That violent, immediate defensiveness told me everything I needed to know. I put the notebook away, kissed my father quietly on the forehead, and drove 300 miles back to my own reality without arguing. 48 hours later, the oppressive tension of that split-level house felt like a distant memory. I stood in the bright, open kitchen of a modern property listed for sale near my hospital in Charlotte. The real estate agent tapped her pen against the granite countertop, watching me admire the natural light pouring through the massive windows. Buying a new home was the next logical step in my carefully structured plan. My hospital board had officially delivered the interview invitation for the division chief position that very morning. Building a fresh space, entirely disconnected from the Lawson family history, felt less like an option and more like a necessity. My quiet viewing was suddenly interrupted by the harsh vibration of my cell phone. Thomas was calling. I stepped out onto the back patio to answer. Dad? Are you okay? His breath hitched over the speaker. Your mother went to the grocery store, the old man whispered, sounding exhausted and deeply afraid of being overheard. Claire, I need to ask you something. Did you tell Madeline she could keep some of the recovery funds for herself? My grip tightened on the phone casing, my fingernails digging into the plastic. No, Dad. Every dollar was supposed to be for the house modifications and your nursing care. Why would you think that? A heavy silence stretched across the line. Because Judith told me to stop asking about the bathroom, he finally admitted, his voice cracking. She said you agreed to let your sister borrow a large portion of the money to cover her wedding venue deposit. She said you could afford it. The patio stones seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I asked him immediately if he had signed any banking documents or legal waivers for my sister. He swore he had not. I promised him his daily medication and his monthly mortgage would always be paid, ensuring he felt completely safe before I ended the connection. I wanted to believe my mother was just blinded by her golden child, unknowingly manipulated by a forged document. The truth, hiding in plain sight, proved much worse. A text message from Judith illuminated my dark bedroom later that evening. Do not ask Madeline about the money before the wedding, the message read. She has waited her whole life for this. 3 minutes later, a second gray bubble popped up on the screen. You earned that much in a few months anyway. Let her have her perfect day. My thumb hovered over the glowing keyboard. A fiery, burning anger demanded that I call her and scream until my lungs gave out. But absolute rage makes people sloppy, and I needed to remain surgical. I took a deep breath, captured high-resolution screenshots of the entire thread, exported the raw data, and emailed the file directly to Aaron Caldwell. Sitting in the polished law office the following afternoon, Aaron slid a thick draft of a formal demand letter across the table. It outlined the exact timeline of the shell company and the $78,000. We can serve them tomorrow morning, the attorney advised, watching my face carefully for permission. I looked at the heavy legal document, then pushed it slowly back toward her. Ruining the wedding ceremony would only give Madeline the ultimate victim card, allowing her to claim the jealous older sister destroyed her happiness out of spite. Not yet, I told Aaron, my voice calm. The preservation notices are already out, and Madeline's access is gone. Hold the demand letter until after the wedding. My father's medication, mortgage contribution, and physical therapy are being paid directly. If Madeline leaves me alone, I will stand in the corner for 20 minutes, fulfill my final duty as her sister, and leave. We can formally confront her after the cake is cut. My exit plan was perfectly sound, assuming my family would simply take my quiet surrender, but I had fundamentally miscalculated the depth of their entitlement. My sister had stolen the money. My mother had decided it belonged to her, The ballroom at the country club felt like a pressure cooker filled with expensive perfume and forced pleasantries. On the morning of the wedding, I had logged into my bank's secure portal one final time, confirming that the preservation notices had been delivered to the primary vendors and that my instant fraud alerts were fully active. I had done everything possible to ensure my father's daily needs remained stable, while leaving Madeline no path to continue her embezzlement. Aaron had promised that our legal net was ready to tighten the moment the ceremony concluded. My goal for the next 20 minutes was simple: walk in, smile for the camera, stay invisible, and leave before the first dance. I arrived well after the ceremony had finished, parking my rental sedan in a secluded spot near the rear service entrance. I did not bother to sign the guest book, preferring to remain a ghost in the periphery of their celebration. The navy silk of my dress blended easily into the shadows near the bar as I watched the crowd from the back. Madeline looked breathtakingly beautiful in her white gown, moving through the center of the floor with an effortless grace that usually masked her sharp edges. For a brief, irrational second, I felt a genuine surge of relief. Perhaps she would finally settle down, leave my father's finances alone, and find some semblance of happiness. I took a slow sip of cold sparkling water and began to scan the exit path, checking the distance to the main doors. The reception hall was a study in deliberate erasure. Large, framed wedding portraits of the bride and groom decorated the tables, but every single family photo was carefully cropped. I saw blurred shoulders and segments of arms in the background, but my own face had been meticulously trimmed away. It was a professional job, tidy and cold. A middle-aged cousin I had not seen in a decade squinted at me from a nearby table, his face twisted in confusion. I offered him a polite, tight-lipped smile and drifted further toward the corner, making myself as small as possible. Near the front of the room, Margaret Whitmore sat at the head table, her posture rigid. The woman was barely touching her champagne, her gaze darting anxiously toward her son. Owen was leaning close to Madeline, laughing at something she whispered, his hand resting possessively on her waist. I turned my back to them, focusing instead on the photographer who was busy directing a large group of bridesmaids. The man holding the camera stepped back to widen his frame, and I inadvertently moved into his line of sight. A flash went off, blindingly bright for a split second, and I knew my silhouette had been captured in the background of a group shot. A bridesmaid in a blush pink dress turned, caught my eye, and leaned in to whisper something to the bride. Madeline turned. Her face, which had been bright with laughter only moments before, hardened into a look of pure, instinctive terror. She whispered something sharply to Owen, grabbed her skirts, and began navigating through the clusters of guests. She was not walking toward the bar or the exit. She was walking directly toward me. The music shifted to a slower, jazzier tempo that did not mask the sudden edge in her voice. She reached me in seconds, her manicured fingers digging into the soft skin of my upper arm with surprising strength. "You," she hissed, her smile not reaching her eyes. "You really had to show up and ruin everything, did you?" "I am just leaving, Madeline," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "I came to wish you well. That is all." She ignored me, her grip tightening until I knew the marks would bruise by morning. She did not want me gone. She wanted me under her control. She wanted to define me before the groom's family could ask any uncomfortable questions about why the successful local sister was not seated at the head table. I felt the familiar weight of the spotlight creeping toward us, an inevitable consequence of her need for public validation. I looked at the exit door, then back at my sister, understanding exactly what was about to happen. My 20 minutes of invisibility had just run out. Then Madeline stepped off the stage and walked straight toward me, microphone in hand, ready to begin the performance of a lifetime. Madeline reached me with the microphone still in her hand. Before I could step through the exit, she caught my arm and pulled me back into the ballroom. Her smile was bright enough for the cameras, but her fingers tightened around me with every step. "Come on," she said through clenched teeth. "Since you decided to show up, you might as well let everyone see you." "I was leaving," I said quietly. She ignored me. The conversations nearest us began to fade as guests noticed the bride dragging an unfamiliar woman toward the stage. Heads turned. Chairs shifted against the polished floor. A photographer lowered his camera, then raised it again when he realized something unexpected was happening. Madeline climbed the first step without releasing me. I could have pulled away. I was stronger than she expected, and the exit was only a few yards behind us. But nearly every person in that room was watching now. Phones were already rising above the tables. If I fought her, she would call me unstable. If I shouted, she would say I had come to destroy her wedding. So I let her lead me beneath the lights. The heat of the spotlight settled over my face and shoulders. Madeline lifted the microphone and introduced me as the sister she had not expected to see. Then she called me the family failure. Her bridesmaids laughed first. Several guests joined them, not because they knew me, but because they believed they were watching a rehearsed joke between sisters. A few smiles disappeared when they noticed I was not laughing. Near the head table, Owen remained silent. His expression had shifted from confusion to discomfort. But Madeline was too focused on the crowd to notice. She continued, listing everything she believed made me defective. No husband, no children, no place in the family. She claimed I had abandoned our father while she gave up everything to care for him. I kept my shoulders straight and my hands open at my sides. I did not interrupt. I wanted every accusation recorded exactly as she chose to say it. Then a chair scraped sharply across the floor. Margaret Whitmore had risen from the head table. Her eyes were fixed on me, wide with disbelief. For one suspended moment, neither of us spoke. I remembered the hospital lights reflected in those same eyes 18 months earlier, when I had stood beside her bed and explained that the tear in her aorta required immediate surgery. Margaret took one step forward. "I know her," she said. The laughter weakened. Madeline lowered the microphone slightly. "What?" Margaret pointed toward me, her voice trembling but clear enough to reach the back of the ballroom. "That is Dr. Claire Bennett. She is the surgeon who saved my life." The remaining laughter vanished. Owen looked at his mother, then at me, and finally at the woman he had just married. In the space of a few seconds, the version of my life Madeline had sold him began to collapse. Madeline tried to pivot, her voice rising in pitch as she attempted to save the moment. "Being a surgeon does not make her a good daughter, Margaret. She still abandoned our parents." I watched my sister, really watched her, and felt a strange, chilling clarity. She was not panicking because I was a doctor. She was panicking because the foundation of her entire deception, the story that I was an uncaring, wealthy, and selfish woman, had just been proven a lie. I reached into my navy clutch and pulled out the thin, cream-colored envelope I had prepared. I did not wave it. I did not shout. I simply held it at my side, waiting for the room to settle. "Is that really what you want to say about me?" I asked, my voice low and steady. "Are you absolutely certain about the narrative you want to present to your new husband?" Madeline glared at me, her chest heaving with exertion, her eyes full of a frantic, burning hatred. She looked as though she wanted to tear the microphone from my hands, but the gaze of 300 guests pinned her in place. She had been given the chance to stop. She had been given the chance to walk away. Judith stood up from the family table, her eyes frantic, and I saw her mouth form a silent, desperate command for my sister to keep going. Madeline tightened her hands on the microphone, her knuckles white, and I knew she was going to choose the escalation. "I am sick of your high and mighty attitude, Claire," Madeline spat, her voice finally dropping its sweet, sugary facade. "You have never given this family anything but shame." I took a single step toward her, the envelope feeling light and sharp in my hand. The time for silence had ended the moment she chose to lie again. "Then," I said, my voice cutting through the ballroom with surgical precision, "where did the $78,000 I sent for Dad's recovery actually go?" The silence that followed was absolute. My sister froze, her face turning a ghastly shade of gray. She looked at the envelope in my hand, and for the first time that night, the performance finally stopped. Madeline's eyes darted toward the exit, but the crowd formed a wall of confused, expectant faces around us. She laughed then, a sharp, jagged sound that did not reach her eyes. "Claire, this is insane. Do not try to make my wedding day about your pathetic obsession with money." She turned toward the room, her voice rising to a shrill, desperate pitch. "She promised to pay for this wedding, everyone. She promised to support our family. And now she is trying to make me look like a thief because she is jealous that I found love and she did not. I reached into the envelope and pulled out the single sheet containing the email she had sent months prior. I did not shove it in her face or scream. I stepped closer to the head table, toward the groom. My movements felt deliberate and precise, the same way I approached a delicate vessel in the operating room. I handed the printed page to Owen. His hands trembled as he took the paper, his eyes scanning the lines of text. "You told me that every single dollar was for Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air. "I never promised to fund a wedding. I funded a recovery plan that required $78,000 to keep my father safe, and not a single grab bar was ever installed in that house." Owen looked up. His face twisted in a mixture of horror and realization. "Is this true, Madeline?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Yet the microphones picked it up clearly. "Did you use the money meant for your father's health to pay for this venue?" Madeline shook her head, her jewelry jangling with the frantic motion. "No, that is a lie. She is manipulating the bank records to make me look bad. She has always been the golden child, and she cannot stand that I am finally happy." I reached into the clutch again. I produced the verification printouts from the county permit office and the home nursing agency. They were brief, stark, and impossible to misinterpret. I held them up so Owen could see the stamps and the official letterheads. "There is no permit for the construction," I said, addressing the groom directly while keeping my composure. "There is no record of my father in the agency's system. Northstar Home Recovery is a shell company, Owen. It does not employ a single contractor, and it does not have a license to operate." The groom dropped the papers onto the tablecloth as if they were burning his skin. He stood up, knocking his chair back against the floor, and turned to look at his bride. The adoration he had held for her only minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, devastating clarity. "Madeline," he demanded, his tone dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. "Tell me you did not take that money. Tell me right now." Madeline tried to reach for his hand, but he recoiled. Before she could craft another lie, Judith came rushing from the family table, her face a mask of panicked rage. She grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin, and shouted toward the crowd, trying to drown out the reality. "Your sister was only borrowing it. You make that much in a few months, Claire. How could you do this to your own family?" The confession hung in the air, echoing off the high ceilings. A wave of murmurs erupted through the ballroom. People pulled out their phones, recording every second, and the realization that my mother had been complicit was written on the faces of every guest in the room. "You knew," I said, staring at my mother. I did not need to shout. The microphones were doing all the work for me. "You knew the bathroom was never modified, and you helped her hide it." Thomas slowly stood up from the family table, his posture slumped and his expression hollow. He looked at Judith, then at Madeline, and finally at me. "I asked them," he said, his voice quiet but audible through the speakers. "I asked them for months when the men were coming to help me walk. They told me to wait. They told me you had already paid for it." The ballroom erupted into chaos. I watched Owen reach for his wedding band, his fingers shaking, but he did not make a scene. He simply looked at my sister, his eyes reflecting a profound, crushing betrayal. "I do not know who I married," he said, the words falling like stones into the silence. He turned, signaling to his mother, and began walking toward the main entrance. Margaret stood up and followed her son without looking back at my sister once. As the wedding party began to dissolve, and the guests started gathering their belongings in an awkward, hurried confusion, my phone buzzed in my clutch. I glanced down at the screen. A critical alert from my bank flashed in bold letters. It was a push notification for a blocked online transfer, triggered by my instant fraud alerts. Madeline was currently standing on the stage, visibly humiliated and exposed, yet she was still trying to initiate an electronic transfer from the care account using her old, unauthorized profile. I looked up from the screen to see her staring at her own phone, her face twisted in a silent, furious rage as she realized the transfer had been blocked. She had just been exposed in front of everyone, yet she was still trying to take more. She was a hollow person, and finally, the entire room could see it. The morning after the wedding felt strangely clinical. Sunlight poured into my kitchen in Charlotte, cold and indifferent, while the silence of the house served as a stark contrast to the chaotic echoes of the reception hall. I sat at my laptop sipping black coffee and watched as Madeline began her final, desperate campaign of public manipulation. She had taken to social media, posting a carefully curated narrative that painted me as a cruel, jealous older sister who had deliberately engineered a scandal to destroy her happiness. She claimed the money had been a legitimate gift, a misunderstood token of support, and that I was merely a vindictive woman who could not stand to see her younger sister thrive. Judith chimed in from her home, calling distant relatives and neighbors, spreading a version of the events where I had been the aggressor, twisting the truth into a story of abandonment and spite. I did not respond. I did not engage in the comment sections or post a rebuttal of my own. My personal strategy was rooted in the same discipline that kept my hands steady in the operating room. I left the public drama to burn itself out, focusing instead on the quiet, methodical work that actually mattered. Aaron Caldwell acted with surgical precision. Within 48 hours, Aaron sent supplemental preservation notices and formal litigation hold letters to the country club, the bridal boutique, the florist, the photographer, and the honeymoon resort. The initial notices had already warned the primary vendors that a financial dispute was developing. The new letters identified the expected civil claims and required the recipients to preserve contracts, payment records, invoices, emails, and account information connected to the wedding. The letters did not magically freeze the evidence or give us immediate access to private vendor records. They placed each recipient on formal notice that relevant material had to be preserved. Any deliberate destruction after that point could later result in serious legal consequences. The forensic accounting firm Aaron employed was run by a woman named Dana Ruiz. Dana proved to be as relentless as she was brilliant. Over the next few weeks, she methodically mapped the movement of my father's medical funds. She traced the money from the Lawson Family Care account directly into the North Star Home Recovery Holding account, and from there, she followed the trail as it split into multiple streams. Every single vendor had been paid using funds specifically earmarked for my father's care. Dana pulled copies of the canceled checks, and to our grim satisfaction, every one of them bore Madeline's bold, elegant signature. The metadata was perhaps the most damning element of the entire file. When Dana examined the digital invoices Madeline had originally sent to me, she found that the files had been created on a device registered to my sister, not a professional construction firm. The logos had been copied and pasted from legitimate local companies, and the contractor's signatures were simply digital images grafted onto the documents. Furthermore, the invoice numbers did not align with any of the company's actual project logs. It was a digital map of deliberate fraud, laid out in plain sight for anyone with the proper credentials to see. Thomas eventually gave a formal statement to the legal team. The old man was frail, his hand shaking as he signed the papers. But he was finally finished with the secrecy. He admitted that no construction crew had ever visited the house, and he confirmed that Judith had pressured him into staying silent, promising that everything was being handled by their daughter. He looked smaller than I had ever remembered him. A man who had simply wanted to heal, but found himself trapped in a web of his own family's greed. I did not cut off his access to medication or his monthly mortgage payments. I continued to handle those directly, ensuring his basic needs were met while making it crystal clear that my financial trust was not something that could be earned back with a simple apology. The civil deposition process was grueling, but it brought every hidden thread into the light. When Judith was placed under oath and questioned by Aaron, she initially tried to characterize the money as a general family fund, arguing that there were no strings attached. Aaron did not raise her voice. She simply pulled out a printout of the email thread Madeline had sent me months before. The lawyer laid the document on the table and asked Judith to explain why my sister had specifically written that every dollar was for my father's care. Judith had no answer. She was forced to admit that she knew my sister had diverted the funds, and that she had been an active participant in convincing me that the project was moving forward while knowing full well it was a fiction. By the time we finalized the records, the mountain of evidence was insurmountable. We had screen captures of the smear campaign, a complete bank trail, the metadata proving the fraudulent creation of the documents, and depositions from both of my parents confirming their participation in the deception. We also had the messages Madeline had sent to Owen and his mother, claiming she had been the sole caregiver for my father, which directly contradicted the lack of any nursing agency record. The prosecutor assigned to the case did not ask whether I still loved my sister or if I felt guilty about the fallout for my parents. She sat in a sterile office, flipping through the binder Dana had organized, and asked a single, pragmatic question. She wanted to know if I was prepared to move forward with a demand for full restitution. I thought about the grab bars that were never installed, the fear in my father's voice when he asked for help, and the brazen way my sister had used my own charity to humiliate me before 300 strangers. I realized then that my pursuit of justice was not about the money, and it was not about revenge for the sake of the past. It was about defining the terms of my own future. I looked the prosecutor in the eye and said yes. My sister's attempt to paint me as the villain had only guaranteed that her actions would be examined with total, unflinching scrutiny. The shell company she had registered just days after my father's stroke proved that her greed was not an impulsive error, but a calculated, pre-planned exploitation. She had been preparing her strike while I was still working overtime shifts at the hospital to provide for them. The final months of the investigation felt like a slow, steady tide rising to meet a cliff. Madeline's legal team eventually realized the wall of evidence we had assembled made a trial, a futile exercise. They began signaling for a plea agreement, hoping to minimize the damage and avoid a public conviction. Madeline even reached out through an intermediary, suggesting that if I dropped the civil litigation and pulled the criminal referral, we could save the family from the crushing weight of the scandal. I watched the screen of my phone as the offer arrived, feeling nothing but a profound, quiet exhaustion. I did not reply. I simply forwarded the communication to Aaron. The law would decide the consequences of the choices my sister had made, and I was finally content to let the process do its work. My own recovery began in the small, empty rooms of a new house, a space where I finally did not have to look over my shoulder to see who was waiting to take advantage of my kindness. I was not destroying my family. I was simply ensuring that they could no longer use me to build their own lives. Owen Whitmore had walked out of that ballroom nearly 10 months ago, leaving behind the wreckage of his short-lived marriage. His departure was not the dramatic outburst of a scorned man, but a quiet, final exit that spoke louder than any argument. In the months that followed, he moved to officially terminate the marriage, presenting documentation that detailed the systemic deception my sister had practiced from the beginning. Madeline lost her status, her reputation within the Whitmore family, and the social standing she had spent years carefully cultivating. She was stripped of the very things she valued most, not by my hand, but by the weight of her own repeated choices. By the time the legal dust finally settled, the financial consequences were absolute. The court ordered Madeline to provide full restitution of the $78,000 she had diverted, including interest and a substantial portion of the legal fees Aaron had accumulated throughout the discovery process. My sister was forced to sell the luxury vehicle she had purchased for the honeymoon, auction off her designer wardrobe, and liquidate assets that had been acquired through the fraud. When her personal accounts failed to cover the total balance, the judgment liens attached to her future earnings, ensuring that every paycheck she touched would be garnished until the debt was satisfied. The criminal justice system moved with a deliberate, cold formality that did not care for her pleas of mercy. Madeline entered a felony fraud plea, admitting to the fabrication of invoices and the acquisition of funds under false pretenses. The sentence mandated 4 months of confinement at a county facility, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. Beyond the restriction of her physical freedom, she was permanently barred from serving as a fiduciary or managing the financial affairs of any family members, a precaution that ensured she could never again exploit my father or anyone else in our circle. Judith, meanwhile, found her own world shrinking rapidly. Once the court stripped Madeline of her financial authority, my mother lost the primary conduit she had used to inflate her own standard of living. I continued to pay for Thomas's medications and his home care directly through authorized service providers, but I refused to provide a single cent of discretionary income. Without the supplemental funds she had grown accustomed to, my parents were forced to refinance their mortgage, which eventually necessitated the sale of the house and a transition into a smaller, more manageable residence. Judith faced her own civil accountability for her role in the concealment of the fraud, a reality she struggled to accept until the very end. Thomas sat in his new living room, the space smaller and quieter, than the home I grew up in. During one of my brief scheduled visits to assist with his physical therapy, he looked up at me with eyes that seemed years older than when I had last seen him. He offered a halting, sincere apology for the years of silence, and for the way he had allowed Judith to dictate the terms of our relationship. "I cannot undo the past, Claire," my father said, his voice trembling slightly in the quiet air. "I know," I answered, keeping my tone gentle but maintaining a firm, professional distance. "I can ensure you are safe, Dad. I can make sure you are fed and warm. But I cannot pretend that the trust which was broken can be repaired simply because you are sorry. That part of our lives is finished." I watched the realization settle over him. It was not a cruel interaction. It was merely a necessary boundary. Our relationship shifted into a new, limited configuration that did not require me to sacrifice my peace of mind for the sake of appearances. Judith made one final, desperate attempt to reclaim the old dynamic during a phone call a few weeks after the sentencing. She spoke with a strained, performative warmth, trying to invoke the classic guilt that had defined my childhood. "Family forgives, Claire," my mother argued, her tone thick with practiced sorrow. "It is what we do." I looked at the phone, then toward the window of my own office, where a garden was starting to take root in the soil I had turned with my own 2 hands. "Forgiveness is a choice, Mom," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the old, familiar, sharp edges. "But forgiveness does not restore access. That privilege is gone." Madeline sent a long, handwritten letter from the facility, claiming that I had single-handedly destroyed her entire life. I did not read the contents. I simply placed the envelope into a folder I kept for my attorney, treating it with the same dispassionate care I would give a medical record that no longer required active attention. It was July of 2026, and I was finally standing in the kitchen of the home I had purchased near the hospital. The walls were painted in a soft, neutral shade I had chosen myself. A small chosen family of close colleagues had helped me move in, filling the cabinets with sensible dishes and the shelves with books that actually belonged to me. The house contained no relics of my past, no photos cropped to exclude my presence, and no hidden debts waiting to be discovered. I placed my phone face down on the granite island as Judith's name flashed once more on the screen, a silent protest against her attempt to reach me. The quiet of the house was not an empty space. It was a sanctuary of my own creation. My hands, which had spent countless hours repairing the lives of strangers, finally felt light. The long, exhausting work of disentangling my identity from the web of their expectations was finished. I had not destroyed my family. I had stopped financing the lie that held it together. You deserve to know that love does not require your self-destruction. When you find yourself constantly sacrificing your financial stability, emotional health, or peace of mind to maintain a relationship, you are not being a supportive family member. You are becoming an enabler for someone else's lack of integrity. True kindness should never be leveraged as a tool for manipulation. And setting firm boundaries is not an act of hostility. It is the most vital step toward reclaiming your own identity. You must learn that you have the absolute right to stop financing the lies others tell, especially when those lies are used to diminish your worth. Protect your resources and your spirit, because the people who truly care about you will respect your boundaries, while those who only value what you can provide will eventually reveal their true intentions when you say no. Have you ever felt guilty for finally putting your own well-being above the demands of someone who took your kindness for granted? And how did that decision change your life?